Farmer Marcus Walsh couldn't believe his eyes when he first spotted them, a cluster of faintly glowing stones nestled between his withering corn stalks. The early morning fog had just begun to lift over his Montana farm when the strange blue-green shimmer caught his attention. He stood frozen in place, rubbing his eyes in disbelief, wondering if the stress of potentially losing his farm to the worst drought in 50 years was finally making him see things. The rocks weren't large, about the size of apples, but their gentle pulsing glow seemed to intensify as he approached them. Marcus had worked this land for over 2 decades, just like his father before him, but he had never seen anything like this. His first thought was that someone might have dumped some kind of chemical waste on his property, but these stones looked almost alive. As he cautiously knelt down to examine them more closely, he noticed something even more bizarre: the soil. Around each stone was dark and moist, as if it had been recently watered, despite no rain falling for months. The dying corn stalks nearest to the rocks even seemed to stand a little taller, their leaves a shade greener than their withered neighbors. Marcus's weathered hands trembled as he reached out to touch one of the stones. To his surprise, it felt cool to the touch, with a smooth surface that seemed to ripple beneath his fingers like water. He counted 7 stones in total, each pulsing with that same mysterious blue-green light that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. As the sun rose higher in the sky, his mind raced with possibilities. In all his years of farming, through droughts and floods, through late frosts and early thaws, he'd never encountered anything that defied explanation quite like this. The agricultural community in Cedar Valley had seen its share of unusual phenomena, but glowing rocks that somehow kept the soil around them moist. This was something entirely different. The past 3 years had been brutal for Marcus and his farm. The changing climate had brought increasingly severe droughts, and this year was proving to be the worst yet. His irrigation pond had dried up months ago, and the well was producing less water with each passing week. The bank had already sent him 2 warning letters about his mortgage payments, and his crops were failing faster than he could figure out how to save them. Standing up, Marcus took a step back to survey the scene. The contrast was striking. These small patches of thriving plants around the stones stood out like oases in a desert of dying crops. He noticed something else too. There seemed to be a pattern to where the stones had appeared. They formed a rough circle, about 30 feet in diameter, as if they had been deliberately placed. His first instinct was to call someone, the local agricultural extension office perhaps, or maybe even the university's geology department. But something held him back. In these parts, strange discoveries had a way of attracting unwanted attention. He'd seen what happened to old Bill Henderson's farm when word got out about the unusual mineral deposits found in his south field. Within months, his land had been tied up in legal battles and environmental studies. No, Marcus decided, he needed to understand what he was dealing with first. If these stones really were having some kind of effect on his soil and crops, he needed to document it properly. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, making sure to capture both the stones themselves and the surprisingly healthy plants surrounding them. As he photographed the last stone, something caught his eye. The glow seemed to pulse in response to his movement, almost like it was reacting to his presence. He turned off his phone's flash and took a video instead, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. The stones were definitely pulsing in a synchronized pattern, their light growing stronger and dimmer in a steady rhythm that reminded him of breathing. The rational part of his mind told him this couldn't be happening. Rocks don't glow, they don't pulse, and they certainly don't create patches of fertile soil in the middle of a drought. But the evidence was right there in front of him, and it represented something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Marcus spent the next hour examining every detail he could observe. He used a stick to carefully dig around one of the stones, revealing that the moist soil extended about 6 inches deep in a perfect circle around each one. He noticed that even the morning dew seemed to collect more heavily on the plants near the stones, and when he checked the soil temperature, it was several degrees cooler than the surrounding earth. As the sun climbed higher and the morning fog burned away completely, Marcus made his decision. He would keep this discovery to himself, at least for now, but he needed to move fast. If these stones really could affect soil moisture and plant growth, they might be exactly what his failing farm needed. He just had to figure out how to harness their power before it was too late. The Walsh family farm had been a cornerstone of Cedar Valley for over a century. Marcus remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell about how his great-grandfather had first settled this land in 1903, armed with nothing but determination and a dream of building something lasting. The old black-and-white photograph of those early days still hung in Marcus's kitchen, a proud family standing in front of their modest farmhouse, surrounded by fields of promising crops. Back then, the Walsh farm had been one of the most productive in Montana, known particularly for its sweet corn and wheat. Marcus had grown up watching his father turn those 200 acres into a model of modern farming efficiency. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, they'd invested in the latest irrigation systems, built temperature-controlled storage facilities, and even experimented with organic farming methods to stay competitive in an ever-changing market. But the last decade had brought challenges that even the most advanced farming techniques couldn't overcome. The droughts had started gradually at first, a dry spell here, a failed rain there. Marcus had watched with growing concern as the patterns of his childhood became increasingly unreliable. The spring rains that had once been as predictable as sunrise now came either in destructive torrents or not at all. 3 years ago, things had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The irrigation pond that had sustained their crops through previous dry spells had begun to shrink, eventually becoming nothing more than a muddy depression in the ground. The well that his father had dug, supposedly deep enough to last generations, was now producing barely enough water to maintain a quarter of their usual crops. Marcus had tried everything. He'd installed moisture-efficient drip systems, switched to drought-resistant crop varieties, and even invested in expensive soil additives that promised to retain what little moisture was available. He'd spent countless nights at his kitchen table, surrounded by bills and loan documents, trying to figure out how to keep the farm afloat for just one more season. The bank manager, Jim Preston, had known Marcus's family for decades, but even he was running out of options. Their last meeting had been particularly difficult. "Marcus," Jim had said, his voice heavy with reluctance, "you know I've done everything I can to help, but we're looking at foreclosure if something doesn't change by the end of this season. Have you considered selling part of the land?" The suggestion had felt like a physical blow. Selling the land wasn't just about losing property. It meant failing the legacy that 4 generations of Walshes had built. Every field had a story. Every corner of the farm held memories. There was the old oak tree where he'd proposed to Sarah, his late wife. The western field where his daughter Emma had learned to drive a tractor before she'd left for college in California, pursuing dreams that the farm could no longer support. The community had noticed the changes too. Cedar Valley had always been a close-knit farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Marcus had seen the concerned looks at the local diner, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the feed store. Some of his neighbors had already sold their farms to large agricultural corporations, their families moving away to seek opportunities in the cities. Last month, Marcus had started selling off equipment just to make ends meet. The newer combine, harvester bought in better times, had been the first to go, Then the backup tractor, and finally, most painfully, his father's restored 1965 Ford pickup truck that had been as much a part of the farm as the fields themselves. Each sale felt like cutting away a piece of himself, but he'd had no choice. The drought had taken more than just its toll on the land. Marcus had watched his own reflection change in the mirror, more grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, the weight of worry settling into his shoulders. At 48, he felt twice his age some mornings, especially after nights spent tossing and turning, haunted by thoughts of being the Walsh who finally lost the farm. Yesterday had been particularly brutal. The latest weather forecast had predicted another 3 weeks without significant rainfall. Marcus had walked his fields at sunset, running the dry, dusty soil through his fingers, seeing the withered corn, stalks barely knee-high when they should have been towering over him. The wheat field, usually his most reliable crop, was patchy and stunted. He'd calculated that without rain, he'd lose at least 70% of his harvest this year. That evening, he'd sat on his porch, looking out over the failing crops, remembering his father's words, "The land always provides, son. You just have to know how to listen to it." He'd gone to bed with those words echoing in his mind, wondering if maybe he'd lost the ability to hear what the land was trying to tell him. And now, standing in his field at dawn, staring at these inexplicable glowing stones, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this was the land finally speaking to him. But what exactly was it trying to say? And more importantly, would he be able to understand its message before it was too late? Standing there in his field, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. The rational part of his mind screamed that he should report this discovery immediately. The strange glowing rocks could be dangerous, possibly radioactive, or even some kind of illegal dump. But another part of him, the part that had watched his family's legacy crumbling away season by season, saw something else. Possibility. He spent the next hour documenting everything about the stones with meticulous care. Using his phone, he took detailed photos and videos, noting how the glow seemed to pulse stronger when he moved closer. He used an old measuring tape from his truck to mark out the exact distances between each stone, discovering they formed an almost perfect circular pattern, roughly 30 feet in diameter. The most intriguing aspect was what was happening to the soil and plants around each stone. The corn stalks within a 3-foot radius of each rock were noticeably healthier, greener, taller, and more robust than their withered neighbors. The soil itself felt different too, cool and moist, with a rich, almost sweet smell that reminded him of earth after a spring rain. Marcus glanced at his watch. It was nearly 8 o'clock. Usually, by this time, he would be making his usual calls to agricultural suppliers, trying to negotiate better prices on the irrigation supplies he could barely afford. Instead, he found himself pulling out his old soil testing kit from the truck's toolbox, something he hadn't used in months because the results had become too depressing to track. The test results only deepened the mystery. The soil around the stones showed nutrient levels he hadn't seen in years. Perfect pH balance, high organic content, and optimal mineral composition. It was as if these small patches of earth had somehow been transformed into perfect growing conditions, despite the drought that had devastated the rest of his land. But it was what happened next that truly challenged everything Marcus thought. He knew about farming. As he was collecting soil samples, he noticed something extraordinary. Tiny water droplets were forming on the surfaces of the stones, running down their sides and seeping into the soil. The rocks weren't just glowing, they were somehow producing water. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone again, this time to do some research. He spent the next hour searching for any similar phenomena, any scientific explanation for what he was seeing. The closest he could find were some articles about bioluminescent minerals and others about moisture harvesting technologies. But nothing. That explained rocks that could apparently generate water from thin air. The decision weighing on him was enormous. If he reported this discovery, his farm would likely become a research site. Scientists, government officials, and who knows who else would descend on his land. He'd seen it happen before to other farmers who'd found unusual things on their property: meteorites, artifacts, rare minerals. Their farms had become more like laboratories than working agricultural operations. But if he kept it secret, at least for now, he might have a chance to understand these stones' potential. Could they somehow help save his failing crops? The evidence around him suggested they might. The healthy patches of corn around each stone were like small beacons of hope in his otherwise dying fields. Marcus walked back to his truck and sat in the driver's seat, his mind racing. He thought about his daughter Emma, away at college, studying environmental science. She'd always been the scientific one in the family, following in her mother's footsteps. What would she make of this discovery? He almost called her right then, but stopped himself. Emma had enough on her plate with her studies, and he didn't want to burden her with this until he knew more. Instead, he made a different decision. He would give himself 1 week to study these stones and document their effects. If he saw any sign that they might be dangerous, any negative impact on the soil, plants, or wildlife, he would report them immediately. But if they continued to show only positive effects, maybe, just maybe, they could be the miracle his farm so desperately needed. With newfound purpose, Marcus began to formulate a plan. He would need to protect the stones, monitor them carefully, and find a way to potentially harness their effects. He drove back to the farmhouse and gathered supplies: stakes to mark the area, a tarp to keep the stones hidden from casual observation, and his old weather station equipment to track temperature and humidity levels around them. As he worked to secure the area, Marcus couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and the stone's glow had become subtler but was still visible. The air around them felt different too, fresher, more alive, as if the very atmosphere was being purified by their presence. By noon, Marcus had transformed the site into what looked like a routine agricultural experiment. He'd placed small flags to mark each stone's location, set up his monitoring equipment, and carefully constructed a shade structure that would both protect the stones and hide them from view. To any passing neighbor, it would look like just another attempt to save his struggling crops. As he stepped back to survey his work, Marcus felt the weight of his decision. He was betting everything on these mysterious stones: his farm, his family's legacy, his future. Was he crazy to pin his hopes on something he couldn't even explain? Or was this exactly what his father had meant about listening to the land? Over the next few days, Marcus devoted himself entirely to studying the mysterious stones and their effects. His daily routine transformed completely. Instead of starting his days with the usual farm maintenance, he now began each morning, before sunrise, carefully documenting any changes in the stones and their surrounding area. The discoveries he made were nothing short of extraordinary. By the third day, he had filled an entire notebook with observations. The most remarkable was how the stone's influence seemed to be spreading. What had started as 3-foot circles of healthy growth around each stone had expanded to 5 feet, then 7. The corn stalks within these zones weren't just surviving, they were thriving in a way he hadn't seen in years. Marcus set up a makeshift laboratory in his barn, converting an old workbench into a research station. He'd brought out every scientific instrument he owned: soil moisture meters, pH testers, thermometers, and even his father's old microscope from the 1970s. Each measurement told the same incredible story. The stones were somehow creating perfect growing conditions in an otherwise hostile environment. The water generation was perhaps the most baffling aspect. He'd set up collection trays around each stone, carefully measuring the amount of moisture they produced. The results defied logic. Each stone was generating approximately 2 gallons of pure, clean water every 24 hours. The water itself was unlike anything he'd ever seen, crystal clear, with a slight blue tinge that matched the stone's glow. But with each passing day, Marcus's excitement was tempered by growing anxiety. He'd noticed unusual things happening that he couldn't quite explain. Sometimes, late at night, he would see flashes of light coming from the field, like silent lightning. The stones pulsing had become more synchronized, following a pattern he couldn't decipher but felt certain held meaning. His isolation was starting to wear on him too. Keeping such a massive secret was harder than he'd anticipated. When his closest neighbor, Tom Henderson, stopped by to borrow some tools, Marcus had nearly burst with the desire to share his discovery. The sight of Tom's own failing crops had made the secret even harder to keep. How could he justify withholding something that might help the entire farming community? The pressure mounted when local agricultural extension agent Sarah Martinez made her monthly visit. She'd been helping Marcus explore drought-resistant farming techniques, and her keen eye didn't miss the strange setup in his cornfield. "Trying something new, Marcus?" she'd asked, gesturing toward the tarped area. He'd mumbled something about experimental irrigation methods, but could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. By the end of the first week, the changes in his test area had become impossible to ignore. The corn stalks there now stood nearly twice as tall as their neighbors, their leaves a deep, healthy green that stood out starkly against the dusty brown of the surrounding field. Marcus had to add extra camouflage to hide the obvious difference from anyone passing by on the road. But it wasn't just the plants that were changing. Marcus began noticing other effects he hadn't anticipated. Small animals, birds, rabbits, even deer, seemed drawn to the area around the stones. They would gather there in the early morning and late evening, as if sensing something he couldn't perceive. The insects in the area had changed too. He'd never seen so many bees and butterflies in his fields, even during the farm's best years. One particularly humid evening, Marcus made a discovery that both thrilled and terrified him. He'd been taking his usual evening measurements when he noticed that the stone's glow had intensified dramatically. As he watched, transfixed, tiny tendrils of light seemed to reach out from one stone to another, creating a web of luminescence above the ground. The air itself felt charged with energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by his notes and photographs, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. The scientist, in him, the practical farmer who relied on proven methods and measurable results, was at war with the part of him that wanted to believe in miracles. The stones were clearly having an effect, but was it safe? Was it sustainable? What would happen if their power continued to grow? His daughter Emma called that evening, as she did every Sunday. It took every ounce of self-control not to tell her about the stones. Instead, he listened as she excitedly described her latest environmental science projects, including one about sustainable agriculture. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here she was, studying theoretical solutions to drought, while he was sitting on what might be the most revolutionary agricultural discovery in history. As he lay in bed that night, watching the faint blue-green glow visible through his bedroom window, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself. The stones were changing his land, but they were also changing him. Every day brought new questions. Was he protecting a miracle, or was he merely postponing the inevitable moment when this discovery would become too big to contain? The crisis began on a Tuesday morning, exactly 10 days after Marcus's discovery of the stones. He woke to find his entire field bathed in an eerie blue glow, far stronger than anything he'd seen before. The stone's power had intensified overnight. But something was wrong, very wrong. As he rushed to the test site, his heart pounding in his chest, he could feel the air crackling with an unusual energy. The protective tarp he'd placed over the area had been blown away, and the monitoring equipment was giving readings that made no sense. The temperature around the stones had dropped to near freezing, despite the summer heat everywhere else. The most alarming change was in the stones themselves. Their once gentle, pulsing glow had become a harsh, constant glare. The water they'd been producing now came in torrents rather than gentle drops, creating small floods that threatened to erode the soil around them. The corn stalks closest to the stones, which had been thriving just yesterday, were now bent and twisted, as if struggling under some invisible pressure. Marcus worked frantically to salvage what he could of his equipment, but the readings were becoming more erratic by the minute. His soil moisture meters were shorting out, and his digital thermometer simply displayed error messages. Even his phone was malfunctioning, the screen flickering wildly whenever he got too close to the stones. As he struggled to understand what was happening, a new terror struck him. What if the stone's effects weren't limited to his test area? He ran to check his well, and his worst fears were confirmed. The water level had dropped dramatically overnight, as if something was drawing it up from deep underground. Even more disturbing were the faint traces of blue-green light he could see reflected in the well's depths. The situation deteriorated rapidly throughout the morning. Birds began falling from the sky around the field, not dead, but disoriented, as if their natural navigation systems had been scrambled. The air took on a metallic taste, and Marcus developed a pounding headache that grew worse the closer he got to the stones. By noon, he could no longer ignore the possibility that he had made a terrible mistake. The power of the stones was clearly growing beyond his control, and his dream of using them to save his farm was turning into a nightmare. He needed help. But who could he possibly turn to? Who would believe him? And more importantly, who would help him without turning his farm into a restricted research zone? His decision was made for him when he noticed the first signs of the stone's influence. Reaching beyond his property lines, the drainage ditch that separated his land from Tom Henderson's farm was glowing faintly, and the vegetation along its banks was beginning to show the same twisted growth he'd seen near the stones. With trembling hands, Marcus reached for his phone. He had to call someone, but before he could dial, the device sparked and died in his hand. The stone's energy field was growing stronger, and any electronic equipment within 50 feet of them was now useless. He rushed back to his farmhouse, his mind racing. The landline there was still working, but who should he call first? As he stood by his kitchen phone, the decision weighing heavily on him, a new sound caught his attention. Vehicles approaching. His farm. He looked out the window to see 3 black SUVs turning into his driveway, followed by what looked like a military truck. His heart sank. Someone had noticed something, and now the decision had been taken out of his hands. Men in hazmat suits began pouring out of the vehicles before they'd even come to a complete stop. Among them, Marcus recognized Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Agricultural Extension Office, but she looked different now, more official, wearing some kind of government ID badge. She approached his house while the others began setting up a perimeter around his field. The next few hours passed in a blur. His farm was declared a containment zone, and he was questioned extensively about the stones, when he'd found them, what changes he'd observed, why he hadn't reported them immediately. Through it all, the stone's power continued to grow. Their light now visible even in broad daylight, their energy causing increasingly strange phenomena across his land. To Marcus's surprise, Dr. Martinez turned out to be his unexpected ally in the chaos that followed. As other officials debated quarantine protocols and containment strategies, she pulled him aside into his kitchen, away from the growing crowd of hazmat-suited figures swarming his property. "I've known something was different here for the past week," she admitted, removing her protective helmet. "The atmospheric readings around your farm have been off the charts, but I wanted to give you time to come forward on your own." "I understand why you didn't." Her expression softened as she looked at the worried farmer. "I'm not just an agricultural agent, Marcus. I'm also part of a specialized research team that investigates unusual environmental phenomena. And what you've discovered here, it's unprecedented." Over coffee at his kitchen table, a small attempt at normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation, Dr. Martinez explained that she was part of a classified government program that studied unconventional solutions to climate change and environmental challenges. The stones, she believed, weren't a threat, but rather an opportunity if they could understand and control their power. "The energy signature we're detecting is unlike anything we've seen before," she explained, showing him readings on a specialized tablet. "It's as if these stones are tapping into the Earth's natural water cycle, but amplifying it exponentially. The problem is, they're now drawing too much energy too quickly. That's what's causing these disruptions." Outside, teams of scientists had begun setting up sophisticated equipment around the stones. Unlike Marcus's improvised monitoring system, their devices seemed capable of withstanding the stone's electromagnetic interference. Through the window, he could see them working methodically, their movements careful and practiced. To his relief, Dr. Martinez's team was taking a remarkably gentle approach. Instead of digging up the stones or attempting to remove them, they were focusing on understanding and stabilizing their effects. "Your observations over the past 10 days are invaluable," she told him, reviewing his detailed notes. "You've given us a crucial baseline of how these stones behave. Now we need your help to bring them back into balance." As the day progressed, more specialists arrived. Geologists, physicists, and even a team of agricultural experts who showed particular interest in the enhanced growth patterns around the stones. To Marcus's surprise, he wasn't shut out of the process. Instead, Dr. Martinez insisted that he be included in their discussions, valuing his practical farming knowledge and first-hand experience with the stones. One of the scientists, Dr. James Chen, a leading expert in sustainable agriculture, took particular interest in Marcus's detailed documentation. "These growth patterns," he explained, pointing to Marcus's photographs, "they're not just enhanced plant growth. The stones appear to be optimizing the entire soil ecosystem. If we can understand and control this process, it could revolutionize how we approach farming in drought-stricken areas." By evening, the crisis had begun to stabilize. The team had erected what they called a containment field around the stones. Not to trap them, but to help regulate their energy output. The harsh glare had softened back to the gentle pulsing Marcus had first observed, and the water production had returned to more manageable levels. "We're not here to take over your farm," Dr. Martinez assured him as they watched the sunset cast strange patterns through the stone's blue-green glow. "What we're proposing is a partnership. We want to work with you to understand these stones and their potential. Your farm could become a testing ground for a new kind of agriculture." The offer she laid out was more than Marcus could have hoped for. The government would provide funding and resources to study the stones, with Marcus retaining ownership of his land and playing a key role in the research. They would help him develop new farming techniques that could benefit not just his farm, but potentially revolutionize agriculture in drought-affected regions worldwide. As night fell, Marcus sat on his porch, watching the teams work under powerful floodlights. The fear and anxiety of the morning had been replaced by something new, a sense of purpose, and dare he think it, hope. He wasn't alone anymore, carrying the weight of this discovery by himself. Instead, he had found himself part of something much bigger, something that could potentially help farmers everywhere. The transformation of the Walsh farm over the next 2 weeks was remarkable. Under the guidance of Dr. Martinez's team and with Marcus's intimate knowledge of his land, They began to unlock the stone's potential in ways he had never imagined possible. The first breakthrough came when Dr. Chen discovered a way to safely channel the stone's water-generating properties through the existing irrigation system. By installing specially designed conduits that could handle the stone's unique energy signature, they were able to distribute their effects more evenly across the fields. The results were immediate and stunning. "Look at this," Marcus called out. One morning, standing in what had been one of his most damaged fields, the corn stalks, which had been withering just weeks ago, now stood tall and strong. The leaves were a deep, healthy green, and the emerging ears were some of the largest he'd ever seen. Soil tests confirmed what their eyes were telling them. The land was healing itself at an accelerated rate, but it wasn't just the crops that were thriving. The stone's influence had begun to create what Dr. Martinez called a microclimate around the farm. Morning dew lasted longer, providing crucial moisture. The soil retained water more efficiently, and the very air seemed charged with vitality. Even the local wildlife had returned in force. Birds nested in unprecedented numbers, and beneficial insects flourished. The team made another fascinating discovery when they analyzed the water produced by the stones. "It's not just water," Dr. Chen explained, showing Marcus the lab results. "It's what we're calling structured water. Water with unique molecular properties that enhance plant growth and soil health. The stones aren't just providing moisture, they're improving the fundamental quality of the water itself." Marcus found himself working alongside PhD students and researchers, sharing his generations of farming knowledge while learning about cutting-edge scientific concepts. His detailed observations from those first 10 days had proved invaluable, helping the team understand how the stone's power had evolved. His kitchen table became a de facto conference room, where traditional farming wisdom met advanced physics and environmental science. One particular success stood out. Using a combination of the stone's energy and conventional farming techniques, they managed to revive a field of wheat that Marcus had written off as a total loss. Within days of receiving the enhanced irrigation, the wheat had not only recovered, but was producing heads of grain that tested off the charts for protein content and nutritional value. The local farming community couldn't help but notice the changes. While the exact nature of the project remained classified, the visible results spoke for themselves. The contrast between Marcus's vibrant green fields and the drought-stricken farms around him was impossible to ignore. Dr. Martinez's team had developed a cover story about testing new agricultural technology, but the real evidence of success was in the growing things themselves. "We're seeing cellular regeneration rates that should be impossible," one of the younger scientists explained excitedly, showing Marcus microscope images of plant tissue samples. "The stones aren't just helping plants grow, they're fundamentally altering how they respond to stress. These crops are actually becoming more resilient at a genetic level. The stones themselves had stabilized, their power now carefully regulated by the containment field. Their glow had settled into a steady rhythm that seemed to pulse in harmony with the day's natural cycles." Marcus noticed that he could now sense subtle changes in their energy, a skill that proved surprisingly useful in fine-tuning their effects. Perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Marcus checked his farm's water table levels. After years of watching them drop steadily, the trend had reversed. The aquifer beneath his land was actually beginning to replenish itself, defying all conventional hydrological expectations. It was as if the stones were helping to restore the land's natural balance, healing not just the surface, but the depths as well. By the end of those 2 weeks, Marcus had to acknowledge a stunning truth. His farm wasn't just surviving anymore. It was on the verge of becoming something revolutionary. The morning he walked his fields with Dr. Martinez, seeing the fruits of their collaboration, he felt a deep sense of validation. His decision to keep the stones secret initially, though risky, had led to this moment of transformation. The day of the official assessment arrived with a mix of excitement and nervous tension. High-ranking officials from various agricultural and environmental agencies were coming to evaluate the project's success. For Marcus, it felt like his entire future, and perhaps the future of farming itself, hung in the balance. The morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect late summer day that farmers dream about. The stone's gentle blue-green glow had become barely noticeable in the daylight, but their effects were unmistakable. Marcus's farm stood like an emerald jewel amid the drought-stricken landscape, his fields bursting with life and vitality. Dr. Martinez had helped him prepare a comprehensive presentation of their findings. The data was staggering. Crop yields had increased by 300% in treated areas. Water usage had dropped by 70%, while soil moisture levels remained optimal. Nutrient density in harvested crops had doubled, and the farm's overall biodiversity had increased dramatically. But the numbers told only part of the story. As the delegation of officials arrived, a parade of black SUVs and government vehicles, Marcus stood tall beside his restored fields. The transformation was so complete that several officials checked their GPS coordinates, convinced they must be at the wrong farm. This couldn't be the same failing property they'd reviewed in their briefing documents just weeks ago. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Martinez began the presentation, standing before the assembled group. What you're about to see represents not just a scientific breakthrough, but a potential solution to one of humanity's most pressing challenges. She nodded to Marcus, inviting him to take the lead in showing them around his transformed farm. Marcus guided the group through his fields, his farmers' calloused hands gesturing to the abundant evidence of success around them. He showed them corn stalks nearly twice their normal height, wheat with heads so heavy they bent toward the earth, and soil so rich it looked like premium potting mix. The officials' skeptical expressions gradually gave way to astonishment. The real revelation came when they reached the stones. Now, properly contained and monitored, their energy had been harnessed into what Dr. Chen called a regenerative agricultural system. The officials watched in amazement as Marcus demonstrated how the stone's power could be directed and controlled, creating optimal growing conditions on demand. "The implications are extraordinary," one senior official remarked, reviewing the data on his tablet. "If this technology can be replicated..." He trailed off, clearly calculating the potential impact on global food security. Another official, a woman Marcus recognized from agricultural policy meetings, was already making calls to Washington. But the most powerful moment came when they visited the test field where Marcus had first discovered the stones. The corn there had not only recovered but had produced a completely new variant. The ears were larger, more nutrient-dense, and showed remarkable resistance to pests and disease. Early tests suggested they could thrive in conditions that would kill conventional crops. "Mr. Walsh," the lead official addressed him directly, "do you understand what you've helped discover here?" The man's voice was serious, but tinged with excitement. "This isn't just about saving one farm. This could change how we think about agriculture in drought-affected regions worldwide." The assessment team spent hours examining every aspect of the operation. They took samples, recorded measurements, and interviewed everyone involved in the project. By late afternoon, they had reached their conclusion. The lead official gathered everyone in Marcus's farmhouse kitchen, the same room where he had first shared his secret with Dr. Martinez. "Based on what we've seen today," the official announced, "we're prepared to authorize full funding for an expanded research program. Mr. Walsh's farm will become the primary test site for what we're calling the Agricultural Regeneration Initiative. With his permission, of course. All eyes turned to Marcus. With full government backing and resources now at their disposal, the transformation of the Walsh farm accelerated at an astonishing pace. The once struggling family farm became the epicenter of a revolutionary agricultural research program, with Marcus at its heart. The change was so dramatic that visitors often had trouble believing this was the same property that had been on the verge of foreclosure just months earlier. The first major development came with the construction of a state-of-the-art research facility on a previously unused portion of his land. The building, a masterpiece of sustainable architecture, was designed to blend seamlessly with the traditional farm architecture while housing some of the most advanced agricultural research equipment in the world. Its curved walls and green roof seemed to emerge naturally from the landscape, while solar panels lined the structure, complemented by the stone's energy being integrated into the facility's power system, making it completely self-sustainable. Inside, the facility was a marvel of modern science. Laboratories equipped with the latest analytical equipment shared space with traditional farming tools, creating a unique blend of old and new. The central atrium featured a massive display showing real-time data from thousands of sensors planted throughout the fields, monitoring everything from soil moisture levels to the stone's energy output. A dedicated wing housed a seed bank, preserving the enhanced plant varieties that had evolved under the stone's influence. Marcus found himself in a role he never expected, part farmer, part scientist, and part teacher. Scientists and agricultural experts from around the world began arriving at his farm, eager to learn about the stones and their applications. But what made Marcus particularly proud was that he could still work his land, now with tools and resources he'd only dreamed about before. His calloused hands still touched the soil daily, maintaining that crucial connection between the scientific advances and practical farming. The educational programs they developed were comprehensive. Small groups of farmers would spend 2 weeks on the property, learning both the theoretical and practical aspects of working with the stone's energy. They studied everything from basic energy field management to advanced cultivation techniques. Marcus insisted that traditional farming wisdom be incorporated into every aspect of the training, ensuring that the new technology enhanced rather than replaced generations of agricultural knowledge. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. The farm's productivity had increased beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Crops grown under the stone's influence commanded premium prices for their superior quality and nutritional content. But Marcus, remembering his own struggles, insisted that a portion of the harvest be sold at standard prices to local markets. He hadn't forgotten his community's struggles with the drought. Emma, his daughter, took a leave of absence from college to join the research team. Her environmental science background proved invaluable in understanding the stone's effects on the ecosystem. She established a dedicated research program studying the long-term environmental impact of the stone's energy, documenting changes in soil composition, water quality, and biodiversity. Her presence brought a youthful energy to the project and helped bridge the gap between traditional farming methods and cutting-edge science. The stones themselves seemed to respond to the positive energy surrounding them. Their power had stabilized at an optimal level, and researchers had learned to fine-tune their effects for different applications. They discovered that the stones' energy could be focused for specific purposes, accelerating growth in one area, enhancing soil rehabilitation in another, or maximizing water production where needed most. The precision with which they could now control these effects opened up entirely new possibilities for specialized crop production. Local wildlife continued to thrive under the stone's influence. The farm became a sanctuary for beneficial insects and birds, creating a natural pest control system that reduced the need for chemical interventions. The property's biodiversity increased monthly, with species returning that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Researchers documented the return of several endangered butterfly species, attracted by the unusually vibrant plant life. Perhaps most significantly, the effects began to spread beyond the farm's boundaries. The enhanced groundwater was gradually improving conditions on neighboring properties. Soil samples from adjacent farms showed increasing signs of rehabilitation, and the local water table was showing signs of recovery for the first time in years. This natural expansion of the stone's influence suggested possibilities for large-scale environmental restoration that no one had initially imagined. 1 year after the discovery of the stones, the Walsh farm hosted its first agricultural innovation summit. Farmers, scientists, and environmental experts from around the world gathered to learn about what was now being called the Walsh method, a holistic approach to farming that combined the stone's power with sustainable agricultural practices. The event transformed the quiet farm into a bustling center of international cooperation, with presentations in multiple languages and demonstrations of the latest applications of the stone's technology. The success stories shared at the summit were inspiring. A farmer from California described how implementing the Walsh method had saved his orchard from a devastating drought. A cooperative from Brazil showcased how the technology had helped restore degraded rainforest soil to productive farmland. Each presentation reinforced the global potential of what had started as one farmer's desperate gamble. Standing at the podium to address the gathered crowd, Marcus could hardly believe how much had changed. His farm, which had been weeks away from foreclosure, was now leading a global agricultural revolution. But what made him proudest was seeing how the discovery was helping others. The research program had already begun implementing similar systems in drought-stricken regions worldwide, with promising early results. The stones were never just about saving my farm, Marcus told the assembled crowd, his voice thick with emotion. They showed us what's possible when we work in harmony with nature instead of against it. Every challenge we faced, every obstacle we overcame, taught us something new about sustainable farming. But more importantly, they taught us about hope, about community, and about the power of working together toward a common goal. As he finished speaking, looking out over the diverse crowd gathered on his land, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The Walsh farm had become more than a success story. It was now a symbol of hope for farmers worldwide, proving that even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, solutions could emerge from the most unexpected places. The future of farming was being written right here, on the same soil where generations of Walshes had worked before him, and for the first time in years, that future looked bright indeed. The most extraordinary discovery came exactly 1 year after Marcus first found the stones. During a routine morning soil analysis, Dr. Martinez's team detected something that would revolutionize their understanding of these mysterious objects. The stone's energy signature had begun replicating itself naturally in the surrounding soil, creating what scientists termed second-generation crystalline formations, SGCFs. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, new crystals were forming spontaneously, each bearing the same ethereal blue-green luminescence as the original stones. These weren't simple copies. The new formations displayed remarkable adaptability, developing unique characteristics based on their specific locations and the environmental challenges present in each area. The discovery sent ripples of excitement through the scientific community and launched an entirely new phase of research at the Walsh farm. What we're witnessing defies conventional crystallography, Dr. Chen explained during an emergency meeting of the international research team. He manipulated a complex holographic model showing the crystal formation process in real time. These New formations represent an entirely new class of mineralogical development. They're not just replicating the original stone's properties, they're evolving, adapting, and in many cases improving upon the original design in response to local environmental conditions. The team established a dedicated research unit focused solely on studying this phenomenon. Working in rotating shifts around the clock, they made discovery after discovery. The new crystals were forming along ancient geological pathways known as ley lines, natural electromagnetic corridors that ancient cultures had somehow known about and used for agricultural purposes centuries ago. Each new crystal cluster exhibited unique properties that seemed perfectly tailored to address the specific challenges of its immediate environment. Emma's breakthrough came after 3 straight nights of analyzing data patterns. She discovered that the crystals weren't just growing randomly, they were forming in response to specific environmental stresses. Formations near depleted aquifers showed enhanced water generation capabilities. Those in areas with poor soil demonstrated superior mineral enrichment properties. Clusters near polluted regions developed unexpected purification abilities. "Dad," she called out, running across the fields one dawn, her tablet displaying complex data patterns. "This is beyond anything we imagined. The original stones aren't just creating copies, they're teaching the earth how to heal itself. Each new crystal formation is like a specialized tool, custom designed for its specific location and purpose." Working with an expanded team that now included geologists, crystallographers, quantum physicists, and environmental scientists from 12 different countries, they developed a method to guide and nurture the growth of new crystals. The process required introducing precise combinations of minerals and creating carefully controlled environmental conditions that could encourage crystal formation in targeted areas. The procedure was incredibly delicate, requiring perfect balance between natural and introduced elements. Even the slightest variation in temperature or mineral composition could affect the outcome. But when successful, the results were nothing short of miraculous. The new crystals would form over a period of weeks, each one perfectly adapted to its specific location and purpose. The first major test case came when James Richardson, a 5th-generation farmer from the neighboring county, approached Marcus with tears in his eyes. His 1,000-acre farm was weeks away from foreclosure, devastated by drought conditions even worse than what the Walsh farm had experienced. After careful consultation with Dr. Martinez's team and obtaining necessary approvals, they initiated their first off-site crystal cultivation project. The transformation of Richardson's test plot exceeded all expectations. Within 3 months, new crystal formations had developed throughout the designated area, each perfectly attuned to the specific challenges of his land. Satellite imagery revealed a stunning contrast. A perfect circle of vibrant green amidst the surrounding brown earth. The success sparked hope throughout the farming community and attracted attention from agricultural organizations worldwide. The government responded by establishing the International Agricultural Crystal Research Initiative, IACRE, a comprehensive program designed to study and implement crystal cultivation globally. Marcus and Emma worked tirelessly with international organizations to develop protocols for responsible crystal cultivation and usage. They were determined to ensure this technology would benefit all farmers, regardless of their economic status or geographical location. Success stories began pouring in from around the world. A farming collective in Ethiopia transformed a drought-stricken region into productive farmland, providing food security for thousands. An agricultural cooperative in India successfully reclaimed salt-affected soil that had been barren for generations. A family farm in Australia's outback became a green oasis in the desert, sparking a regeneration of the local ecosystem. The scientific community's initial skepticism transformed into enthusiastic acceptance as peer-reviewed studies confirmed the crystal's effectiveness. Research papers appeared in prestigious journals, and universities worldwide began incorporating the Walsh crystal method into their agricultural science programs. What had started as a mysterious discovery on a failing Montana farm had evolved into a globally recognized solution for sustainable agriculture. Each evening, Marcus would walk the fields with Emma, marveling at how the original stones continued their steady pulse of blue-green light, now surrounded by a vast network of smaller crystals. Each new formation contributed its own gentle glow to the landscape, creating a mesmerizing pattern that could be seen from satellite imagery. The Walsh farm had become the epicenter of a gradually expanding web of light, as crystal formations spread their influence across the region in an intricate pattern that perfectly followed the ancient ley lines. The transformation wasn't limited to agriculture alone. The crystal's ability to purify water and regenerate soil had far-reaching implications for environmental restoration projects worldwide. Contaminated industrial sites were being cleaned, dead zones in oceans were showing signs of recovery, and desert regions were beginning to bloom again. One evening, as Marcus and Emma walked the fields together, she shared something that touched his heart deeply. "You know what Mom used to say about the land having its own wisdom? She was right, Dad. These stones, these crystals, they're proof that nature has solutions to problems we haven't even fully understood yet. We just have to be humble enough to listen and learn." The memory of Sarah brought tears to Marcus's eyes. She had always believed in the farm's potential, even during the darkest times. Now the Walsh family farm had become more than just a successful agricultural operation. It was a symbol of hope for farmers worldwide, proving that solutions to seemingly impossible challenges could emerge from the most unexpected places. As the sun set over his transformed land, casting long shadows through fields of thriving crops, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. The mysterious stones had done more than save his farm. They had opened a door to a future where farming could thrive even in the face of climate change and environmental challenges. They had shown that nature, when properly understood and respected, held solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable. Have you ever experienced a moment where something that seemed impossible turned into a miracle, where hope appeared in the darkest moment? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found inspiration in this tale of transformation, don't forget to like and subscribe for more extraordinary stories that remind us of the magic that exists in our world. Sometimes the most amazing discoveries happen when we're brave enough to believe in possibilities. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey, and we'll see you in the next video.